The constitutive relations, despite their simplicity, the constitutive relations are probably the most important equations that go along with Maxwell's equations. And these are the things that actually describe the response of electromagnetic fields have with matter. So first we'll talk about the electric response of materials. We will parallel that and talk about the magnetic response of materials, then talk about how we can classify materials based on everything that we've talked about. Remember that there's two ways that we can have electric energy. We can have electric energy in the field itself, and we call that the electric field intensity. We can also store electric energy at the atomic scale in the form of these displaced electron orbitals. We kind of stretch the electrons to one side of the atoms and the nuclei to the other, and we get this tiny electric dipole. And it's like a mass on a spring. It wants to spring back into place, so we are storing energy. The electric flux density, this is the all-inclusive term that includes both the ability to store energy in the field and the ability to store energy in matter. And when these electron orbitals are stretched away from the nuclei, we call the material polarized, and we describe this with a polarization vector P. Not to be confused with the polarization vector we'll talk about when we discuss waves. It's an unfortunate reuse of the vector P and even the word polarization, but it's two completely different things. So the polarization is related to the electric field intensity through the electric susceptibility. This electric susceptibility, this chi-e, this is a measure of how easy those electron orbitals are to stretch in response to an electric field. And it has no units. So to convert the units from electric field intensity to material polarization, we include the free space permittivity here. Let's go into a little bit more detail about the electric polarization. So we apply an electric field E onto matter. That electric field pushes the electron orbitals one way, pulls the nuclei the other way, and they get stretched, and we get an electric dipole that forms. The electric susceptibility is the ease at which those electron orbitals are stretched or displaced from the nuclei, and we get a polarization in the end. And we've described this very much like a mass on a spring. So the electric field is the force that would pull on the spring. The electrostatic attraction between the electrons and the nuclei, that's the restoring force of the spring. And of course, when we stretch a spring, it can store energy. Now, a spring is described by Hooke's law. The displacement of the string is roughly linear to the force applied. But we also know that if we pull on that spring hard enough, that the displacement becomes nonlinear with the force that's applied. So how do we express this mathematically? Well, in one way, we could say we have no idea how to express that. So when we have no idea, what we tend to do is just write the polarization, in this case, the displacement, as a polynomial expansion. So we do that and we get all of these other terms. So what I'm showing in blue here, this is the typical linear response. This is what we talk about 99% of the time when we're talking about material polarization. But there are these other terms here that arise and become significant when the electric field is strong enough to bring out the nonlinear properties of a medium. So all these other terms, this is the nonlinear response of the medium. And so this first term, this ordinary linear susceptibility, we call chi1, and then we would have a chi2, chi3, chi4, and so on up. So everything chi2 and above, these are talking about the nonlinear response. The chi1 has no units, but all of these other ones do carry units. So chi2, for example, meters per volt, then meters squared per volt squared, and so on. So the permittivity and the susceptibility are related, and so let's derive that relation. Here we're writing the electric flux density as the sum of the electric field intensity and the material polarization. And of course, we have our free space permittivity converting the units of E into the units of D. Well, remember that the material polarization is this chi1 term times the applied electric field, and of course also multiplying by epsilon naught to convert the units. Well, now we have an epsilon naught and an electric field E that we can factor out of this expression on the right. So we'll bring the epsilon naught out to the left and the electric field out to the right. And in parentheses here, we have 1 plus our electric susceptibility. Let's go back to one of the ways that we originally wrote our constitutive relation, and that is the electric flux density equals the permittivity times the electric field. But I've expanded the permittivity as the free space permittivity times the relative permittivity. Now, if we look at these two equations on the right-hand side long enough, what we'll see is that the relative permittivity has to be 1 plus the electric susceptibility. So this is the relation between permittivity and susceptibility. More specifically, it's the relative permittivity that's related to the susceptibility. The one term here is describing the ability of vacuum to store electric energy, and that's in the field itself. The chi term is describing the ability of matter to store electric energy. So the dielectric constant, or this relative permittivity, we say is the ability of the medium to store electric energy, which could be the field or displaced dipoles. Now we're going to tell the same exact story, but for magnetic fields. There is two ways that we can have magnetic energy. We can have magnetic energy in the field itself. We call that the magnetic field intensity. We can also have a material that is magnetized, and we'll describe that with a vector M. The electric flux density is the all-inclusive magnetic field term that accounts for both forms of magnetic energy. We can relate the magnetization M to the magnetic field intensity H through the magnetic susceptibility. So this term tells us how easily the magnetic dipoles are tilted or rotated. And we also need this free space permeability to convert the units from H to M. The magnetic susceptibility term here has no units. Well, the magnetization is also nonlinear. If we pull hard enough on these magnetic dipoles, the displacement or the rotation will exhibit a nonlinear response. It takes very intense magnetic fields to do that, but it does happen. And we still call these chi1, chi2, chi3 terms. The units are a little bit different. The chi2 is meters per amp, chi3 meters squared per amp squared, and so on. But this first term is what we use 99% of the time, where there's a linear relationship between the applied magnetic field and the magnetization. But when the magnetic field is strong enough, these other terms can become significant. There's a relation between the permeability and the magnetic susceptibility. So we had our original constitutive relation, B equals mu times H, but we've expanded mu as the product of the free space permeability times the relative permeability. We also wrote B as the sum of the free space, or the ability for vacuum to store magnetic energy, plus the magnetization, which is H times the magnetic susceptibility and times the free space permeability to convert units. I can factor out the mu naught, and I can also factor out the H, and we end up over here. Now, comparing this final expression to what we had over here, we can see that the relative permeability is 1 plus the magnetic susceptibility. And the 1 represents the ability for vacuum to store magnetic energy, and the chi sub m term is the ability for matter to store the magnetic energy. There are three types of magnetic materials, or three broad classes of magnetic materials. The first is diamagnetic, and these have a negative magnetic susceptibility. And we could make an argument that really all materials are diamagnetic, but usually pretty weak. So these are the things that to us really don't seem to have any magnetic response at all. So think copper, silver, gold, right? If we hold a magnet to those or a kitchen magnet, nothing really seems to happen. Those don't work with a magnet. We need more things like iron or other materials. Then there's the paramagnetic. These have a positive but small magnetic susceptibility. That means they're magnetizable, so we can expose them to a magnetic field. The magnetic dipoles will line up, but as soon as the magnetic field is gone, it demagnetizes. So think of nails in a paperclip. If we put a kitchen magnet to them, those do become magnetized. They can act as their own magnet, but as soon as we take the magnet away, they lose their magnetic response. Then last, there's the ferromagnetic materials. These have a very large and positive susceptibility. And these, when they're exposed to a magnetic field, and then when the magnetic field is removed, they retain their magnetization. So iron, nickel, cobalt, some alloys. Now, not all have the equal ability to retain that magnetization, but they all will maintain it for a relatively long time, especially compared to the paramagnetic. Anisotropy. We've been explaining the dielectric response of materials as the electron orbital stretching in response to an electric field that form these little electric dipoles. Just due to how the atoms and molecules are put together, there are certain directions that those charges can displace more easily than others. And so what ends up happening is the permittivity of the medium becomes a function of direction. It's higher in some directions than others when there's directions that the charges can more easily displace than others. Now, when this is the case, the permittivity becomes a tensor. Now, we live in a three-dimensional world, so our tensors are 3 by 3 matrices. And really what this is telling us is that we apply an electric field to a medium, and it turns out the flux can actually be in a slightly different direction than the applied electric field. And that's what tensors do. It's like a generalization to a scalar. If we multiply a vector by a scalar, we get a vector in that same direction just with a different magnitude. But if we multiply a vector by a tensor, that can not only scale the magnitude of that vector, but its direction. And another way we can interpret these elements here, if we think of epsilon sub ij, where ij are the tensor or matrix indices here, we can think of that as how much E sub j contributes to D sub I. So just think of this as matrix math here. Our dx is epsilon xx times ex, epsilon xy times ey, and epsilon xz times ez. So if we look at epsilon xz, that's telling us how much the z component of the electric field E contributes to the x component of the electric flux D. So in general, D and E do not have to be in the same direction. And in fact, in an anisotropic medium, most often they are not in the same direction. And this leads to some very interesting phenomena. There are various types of anisotropy. Now, it turns out we live in a three-dimensional world. We really can only have three numbers in a tensor. We get these numbers in the off-diagonal terms when we're looking at this tensor in something that's not the natural coordinates of the crystal. If we were to look at the crystalline structure of the atoms in a crystal, there's certain axes that they align to. And if we analyze this in those natural axes of the crystal, we will only see three numbers. However, if we rotate that crystal different than our coordinates, then these three numbers in a tensor start leaking off into the off-diagonal terms. So when we are classifying anisotropy, we want to look at these in the principal axis directions, which I've just written generically as A, B, and C. When we do that, we always have a diagonal tensor, and we only ever have three numbers. Now, when all three numbers are the same, we call this isotropic. And this is what we've been talking about up to this point, D equals epsilon E, where epsilon can really just be a single number. And E and D are always in the same direction. And this is how we learn electromagnetics. And suddenly it seems really weird and exotic when D and E are not in the same direction. But all it takes is anisotropy. There's lots of anisotropic materials out there. It's really not that uncommon. It's just that we don't talk about it a whole lot in an electromagnetics class. In a uniaxial medium, we have two directions that have one permittivity value, that's the same, and a third direction that is something different. So when one of them is different, this is called a uniaxial medium. And this one that is different we'll call the extraordinary permittivity. The other two we'll call the ordinary permittivity. We can calculate what's called the birefringence, the change in the epsilon, that's the extraordinary minus the ordinary. When this is a positive number, we will call this an ordinary uniaxial medium, and I have positive birefringence. When this is a negative number, this would have negative birefringence, and both exist. We can have the extraordinary permittivity be lower or higher than the ordinary. Typically, it's higher. There's also the case where all three directions have a different permittivity. We call these biaxial materials. The convention is that we put the biggest number in this axis, then the second biggest number here, and then the smallest number in the upper left. We do this when we don't really care about the directions, but when we actually have a chosen coordinate system, we are not, of course, forced to write them there. We need to write them in the correct order that will tell us the correct permittivity in each direction. There's more things that can happen. We can have something called doubly anisotropic. That means both the permittivity and the permeability are tensor quantities. If the permeability is a tensor quantity, then the magnetic field intensity and the magnetic flux density can be in different directions. We can have chiral materials. Notice there's a J term here, so suddenly X and Y are coupled with each other and have different phases. And what ends up happening here is that there's some kind of chiral or spiraling geometry at the atomic scale, and electric or magnetic fields will rotate as they propagate through these gyroelectric or gyromagnetic materials. Last, we'll classify all materials as either ordinary or bimaterials in various combinations. We can have materials that are isotropic and also ordinary, and we just have our ordinary constitutive relations. This is what we'll use throughout this course, and I would say throughout almost all of the electromagnetics courses taught, these are the constitutive relations that are used because they're the simplest, but they're definitely not the only ones. Let's keep going. We can have ordinary materials that are anisotropic, and that's where our permittivity and permeability become tensors, and E and D can be in different directions, as well as H and B being in different directions. There is what is called bi-isotropic materials. Isotropic means our constitutive parameters are not tensors, they're just single scalar quantities. But bi, look what happens to our constitutive relations. They now contain both an E and an H term. So an H can now directly contribute to electric flux, and an electric field can directly contribute to a magnetic flux. That's rather exotic. So this is bi-isotropic. And then last, we can have bi-anisotropic materials. It's the same thing as the bi-isotropic, but our constitutive parameters here are now tensor quantities.